Now I will be introducing you to our next panelist for this event from J Street. So a little background on J Street. J Street organizes pro-Israel, pro-peace Americans to promote US policies that embody their deeply held Jewish and democratic values and help secure the state of Israel as a democratic homeland for the Jewish people. They believe that only a negotiated resolution agreed to by Israelis and Palestinians can meet the legitimate needs and national aspirations of both peoples. We will now be hearing from J Street interns Carla, Montea James, Morgan Seer, and Josh Curtis to hear their insight on the Israel-Palestine conflict. A little bit about our panelists. So Morgan Seer is a recent graduate from Duke University and an alumni of J Street U. Growing up in Oklahoma, she first visited Israel-Palestine with her church, which inspired her work and involvement with J Street. She was co-chair of J Street U Duke for 2 years and a regional leader for 2 years as well. Morgan also spent time abroad in Jerusalem, where she helps lead other college students on trips with J Street in Israel and Palestine to help show the side of Israel that study abroad does not always show. Now she is still involved with J Street in working for the North Carolina Attorney General Josh Stein's re-election campaign. Now I will be introducing Josh Curtis. He graduated from Duke University in 2019 with majors in economics and Asian Middle Eastern studies. While at Duke, Josh was active in Jewish life, helped cultivate holistic student engagement with the Middle East, and co-chaired the campus's J Street U chapter for 3 years. Since high school, he has traveled to Israel-Palestine and the wider MENA region on 4 occasions. These experiences have taught him the importance of narrative in shaping conflict and development to address issues of trauma and identity. He currently works at the National Endowment for Democracy in Washington, D.C., focusing on transnational democratic challenges and responding to crises. He still volunteers with J Street via Advocacy Corps and the DC Metro chapter. Finally, I will be introducing Carla Montea James. She is currently a senior political science and history double major and pursuing a certificate in international relations at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Carla was raised Catholic, but became involved in the Jewish community at UMass and has served as an outreach intern for UMass Hillel since her sophomore year. Her roles include educating students about the Jewish community, Judaism and Israel staffing, a trip to Israel for non-Jewish leaders. Carla started as a J Street U chapter at UMass to combine her passion for politics and policy with her pro-Israel, pro-Palestine, pro-peace advocacy. She currently serves as the president of UMass chapter and has elections chair for the Northeast, organizing chapters in the region to elect J Street endorsed candidates that support human rights and diplomacy first foreign policy. Now the panelists will be beginning a short keynote speech. Thank you guys all for joining us today.
Hi, folks. So thank you so much for the introduction, Rebecca. My name's Josh. I want to start off by saying, how I got involved in this work in general. So growing up in elementary school and Hebrew school, I was very interested in history, Judaism, and maps. And I think like a lot of Jews, learned a lot about Israel and about Jewish history. And I remember we had a Hebrew class and a Judaica class at Hebrew school every Monday and Wednesday. And I would sit in my Judaica class, which is like Jewish history and culture, just staring at the timeline of Jewish history and drawing maps of the ancient Near East, and just fascinated by this idea that my people had this great history, this great long history, but as my teachers always said, it wasn't about being a powerful people. It was about having a mission this whole time. And that from our earliest days, we revered Solomon the Wise, not Solomon the Great. That people would come from all over to ask him questions, and he would give them answers that would try to make life better. And for 2,000 years or more, we didn't have a chance to really be the best we could for the world because we were never in control of our own fate. That we were in exile, we were trying to fit ourselves into someone else's society, someone else's world, trying not to bring too much attention on ourselves, basically. and that Israel was, when it was founded, this culmination of the Jewish story. Finally, we had sovereignty. Finally, we had control of our own fate. Finally, we could use our power for righteousness, rather than, just to enrich ourselves or something like that. And I remember Mora Shlomit, my teacher, saying that we're not a perfect people, but we're always striving to be better. We might be at war with the Palestinians, but we're always looking to make peace. And so I was really excited in the summer of 2013 in high school to go with NIFTY, which is the North American Federation of Temple Youth, the Reform Movement's youth organization. In my camp, a Jewish summer camp, I went to Israel for the summer, and they had us go through all of the common experiences, go have fun in the Dead Sea, go pray at the Western Wall, and they had us experience what life is like for the Bedouins in the desert. It was particularly memorable because they were hoping that we might get some closer experience to what the Exodus would have been like, because this is all our history. This is a place imbued with our culture, and that now we're back and the society is ours. It's not, we don't have to fit ourselves in somewhere else because we're there. And so I just felt so great about this experience that we would talk to activists and they talk about all of the cool things they're doing in line with Jewish values to make life better, whether it's, for the poor in Israel or for, people who need water else around the world. But when we went to the border in the Golan Heights, we were talking about this triumph of Jewish history in 1973 when Israel defeated its neighbors to basically continue to exist. We were interrupted by the sound of mortar fire. And looking across the border across the UN demarcated border with Syria. On the other side of the blue helmets, as they're called, the peacekeepers, all the greenery died. And we just saw smoke rising from the cities in the distance because it's 2013 and the Syrian civil war is raging. And I asked our guide, Michal, what Israel was doing to help its neighbors in Syria as they struggled for justice, for democracy. And I remember her looking at me with a troubled look and saying, Israelis are afraid. And the devil we know is maybe better than the devil we don't. And so Israel isn't doing anything. And really, we don't know what to do. And so even though that summer, there were peace negotiations that had started between Israelis and Palestinians, I took away that Israel is, challenged and Israelis are afraid. And over the year after I got home and came to the United States, the war in Gaza eventually began and negotiations broke down. And after that war in Gaza, a disastrous war, there was no effort by Israeli leaders to try to rally some aid to help reconstruct the Gaza Strip after all the damage had been done. In fact, the Israeli generals were saying, they were warning the world and the public that if nothing is done to solve this problem, we're going to have to go to war again in probably 2 years and 3 years and 4 years and 5 years, again and again and again. It's going to be more violence. And by and large, the response was, okay, if it is what it is, what can we do? And in fact, I remember Prime Minister Netanyahu decided to build more settlements in the West Bank as a punishment. Wrong people, wrong authority, didn't matter to him. And so it became clear to me that Israel will not just be some culmination of the Jewish mission, as I felt, for justice in the world, using power for righteousness on its own. Everyone who wants it to be that has to take an active role. And that's not just Jews and Zionists and Israelis around the world, but all of our allies as well. Palestinians, Americans of all faiths and ethnicities, everyone has a stake in helping make Israel what I think a lot of Jews want it to be and what I think a lot of other people want it to be. No leader is ever destined to be a perfect leader by themselves. And so that's why I got involved in J Street U when I came to college. I was drawn to the sense of, what I think I could call idealistic realism, that we have this pretty idealist vision of ending the occupation, bringing peace to the whole region, and eventually self-determination, but that we have to be realistic about how we're going to do it. We have to build political power. We have to protect Palestinian villages as they are in the system that they're in the occupied West Bank. So we did work to raise the profile of Susia and other villages. I've done lobbying with J Street U and later with J Street, now that I live in DC, to preserve the Iran deal, to prevent more violence and warfare and escalation of arms races in the region. And all of this ultimately depends on electoral politics as well, which is why this year was such an important election. And I had been helping J Street do a lot of phone banking. And I know that both Morgan and Carla are very involved in lots of other aspects of J Street and J Street U's work. So I want to turn this over to them at this point.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. I think, like Josh said, involved in a lot of other aspects of the of J Street and J Street U. Josh and I actually were at school together, and so we had the chance to be at J Street U and co-chairs even for some time, much to his chagrin, I'm sure. But yeah, I want to start a little bit further back in my timeline because similar to Josh, my story doesn't start with college. It doesn't start whenever I walked on to my school's campus. It started a long time ago. So I'm not Jewish, and I was raised Presbyterian, and kind of grew up really caring about Bible stories and like knowing about all the history and like just being like kind of like an total awe of the fact that like my faith or like this book that I'm told is like important actually happened and isn't just like a bunch of like, it's not just like Grimm's fairy tales where it's like vaguely somewhere. It's like, oh, Jerusalem still exists, Bethlehem still exists, like these are real actual places. And I was just like utterly fascinated with the history just based on like the fact that like, wow, like all these places that all these important people for so many kinds of people, they lived, and it like, this isn't like a hypothetical place. So I was always like really interested in Israel-Palestine from like that perspective. And like, of course, growing up, I'm from Oklahoma, and there's not Israel-Palestine conversations. The most I remember growing up is like you heard, oh, it's really dangerous, like there's a car bombing or a stabbing. And that just, and I was like, okay, so like it's clearly not peaceful, but as far as like actually learning what was going on there, I had no idea, because not only is there like no real resources, is like I just had no concept of like how to ask these questions or where to ask these questions, or that there were even questions to ask. And so as I kind of grew up, my senior year, my church runs this trip, and it is a kind of historically, biblically based trip to Israel-Palestine. It's a 10-day trip over spring break, where we have a class for 2 months going over all of the stories of like, where are we going? Why are we going these places? And like, what is important here? And so I was naturally like super excited, like this place that I've like grown attached to, just like in theory, being like told like, oh, the history is wild. And it's like, there's so much history in this one place, and it matters to so many kinds of people, like billions of people all over the world. Like it's important. So I get to go to this place with my church, and so we're going, and the first, I think it was like 8 days of the trip, we spend it on the Israeli side of the Green Line, which is the border between Israel and Palestine. In theory, that was decided in like the 1967 war, I believe. And so we spend 8 days on that side, and I'm falling in love with every part of Israel that I'm seeing. I am on the coast, walking up and down like Roman ruins. I am walking through the streets of Jerusalem, just like feeling how old and just like how beautiful the city is. I'm exploring and understanding so many different aspects of this country for the first time. And then on our last day, we're going to Bethlehem, because that's kind of a big deal in Christianity. And so they're like telling us, they're like, okay, be careful. They're kind of like prepping us a little bit, but like we had never talked about the politics of what was going on. We had never talked about the fact, like what we were going to see in Palestine. We were just told Palestine's different. Palestine's more dangerous, but there's no real explanation for why. And so as we're getting off the bus to go into Manger Square, which is where the church, the church is there, built over the supposed manger of where Jesus was born. And as soon as I step off the bus, I just notice a stark difference. Like everything kind of seems to be gray. Life just doesn't feel as like vibrant as like walking in Jerusalem even felt, or going around Nazareth. Like there was like, and those are two very different cities. And then it's like I step into Bethlehem, and all of a sudden it's just starkly different. Like you can actually like imagine like a 90s movie where it's like you have like the colors and everything's like bright and happy and everything's fine, and then all of a sudden I step off and it's like, oh, everything's muted. And that's how it just seemed to me, and I was like, this is weird. Like in one of the holiest places on earth, like this land, like why does it feel suffocated? Like this should be the place where people of all faiths can breathe. And I knew something was off, but it was a trip, so we had to continue on. And that trip kind of in itself inspired me to kind of study this more and learn more about this, and like how can I help, because like my faith is so important to me. Like everyone should be able to feel comfortable in the land that they connect with. That was really important to me, and I was like, how can we find a way that peace can just be brought to this land that is amazing with so much rich history and people. And so I was like, okay, I'll study Arabic and study international politics. And I went to school like the following fall, and I was just like, wow, I hope other people care about Israeli politics. Little did I know that it is actually a much bigger, it's a much bigger field than I had ever imagined or anticipated, especially coming from Oklahoma. And I found J Street. I found, oh, I'm so sorry. I found J Street U. I found my Israeli Culture Club, and I found a different Israeli group that was just strictly pro-Israel. And I was kind of like looking around, and I was like, okay, like culture's great, don't get me wrong. Big fan of Bamba, and which is like a peanut flavored snack. And like the culture is great, but that's not really what I'm looking for. And so then I came down to the two Israeli political groups, and it was either be pro-Israel or be pro-Israel, pro-peace, and actually talk about Palestinians and their lives and the impact of Israel on Palestinians as a whole. And frankly, just not including Palestinians in the conversation did not make sense to me. I just could not fathom not including Palestinians in the conversation whenever we're supposed to be talking about making peace. And it's like, well, who are we making peace with? We can't have a peaceful group without having the other side talking to us. So I naturally ended up in J Street U, and that's how I got to know Josh, which little did I know at the time that J Street U would become, and J Street would just like continue to be such a strong part of my life. While working at like on my campus, we organized a coalition on our campus that Josh was a lot of this conversation as well, speaking out against the Muslim ban, which was just kind of like connected to like the broader whole of like what we're trying to achieve like in J Street and J Street U's politics. We focused on stopping village demolitions in the West Bank. Susia was one, Khan al-Ahmar was another one. And we did various like different outreach with our Hillel, which is the Jewish life group on campus, like the Jewish Center for Jewish Life. Anyway, and trying to work specifically with Birthright and redoing their education to actually start talking about Palestinians whenever they take groups of young Jews to Israel, just to like bring it into the conversation. All of this kind of working towards the idea that we need to break down a narrative that has kind of been portrayed to us as, we'll talk about Israel, but we're not going to talk about Palestine. It's too dark. And I'm still currently involved with J Street Advocacy Corps, but at this point, Carla, I think, will be able to talk a lot more about the current work that J Street U students are up to.
Thank you, Morgan and Josh. My name is Carla, and I was also raised Christian. I went to Catholic school growing up, which means my upbringing was shaped by Christian values like service, justice, compassion, and peace. And when I went to college, I took classes about the Middle East and the conflict. And there I can learn about the historical and geopolitical importance of Israel-Palestine. But it wasn't until I became friends with people involved in UMass Hillel, and I became friends with a lot of Jewish people, and I became involved in Hillel myself, that I realized the importance of Israel in the Jewish community. And then I went to Israel for the first time with my Hillel. That's when I really truly connected with what was happening. And I felt it on a very personal level. I felt so much pain on both sides because of the conflict. And sorry. That's when I really became very invested in what was happening there. And I think it was partly because of my Christian values that I started J Street U at UMass, because I felt like it was my responsibility to do something to solve this conflict, and I didn't really know what to do. And this felt like a start to start that conversation about what's happening and taking into consideration both sides. This year, J Street students across the country, including myself, organized to get people that share our values and our mission of peace in the Middle East elected into office. And we made thousands of calls for Joe Biden and others because we understood that the future of the US and Israel and Palestine depended on it. And our other campaign this year is to work with Hillel chapters on our campuses to revise and change their communal guidelines to make sure that criticism of Israel is allowed in our Hillels and the Palestinian perspective is also talked about. And we're doing this work because we want to make the Jewish community understand that the best thing we can do for Israel is to work for a solution that recognizes the dignity of both Israelis and Palestinians instead of just focusing on one side of the conflict and ignoring the other one. And I was personally so excited to learn about what Churches for Middle East Peace is doing, because for far too long, American foreign policy towards Israel has been driven by Christians and specifically evangelicals that want to see Jews return to the Holy Land, but don't really care about the humanity on both sides. And I'm glad this organization wants to shape foreign policy towards the Middle East based on our shared Christian values and human rights. And I want to see this organization succeed because I feel like both Jewish people and Christians should push each other to work for a solution that works for everyone and recognizes that this conflict has caused a lot of pain. And I'm glad that Christians are like taking part into this into what's happening and trying to find a solution, because I don't think we can ignore it.
Yeah, so I see we have until 1:25 before we start the Q&A. So I think I'd like to elaborate a little bit based on, I think we can all elaborate a little bit more on what we're doing at present based on our experiences, how our experience flows into some of these actions. I mean, I think the oxygen has sort of been sucked out of a lot of work for the past couple months by the election, but that's only because this election was really important for the future of Israel-Palestine. I get, I think, far too many updates, news updates from different organizations about what's going on in the region, and it was pretty clear, this de facto creeping annexation has been steamrolling towards more de jure annexation for quite a while, and that has very real effects. Like, I think, Morgan, I really liked your description of something just felt different, muted in Bethlehem. I think that's the case for and I think it's also notable there that that wasn't the case in Nazareth, which is also an Arab city. I often heard from certain people when I've been in Israel that it's just all the Arab cities, they just don't know how to develop properly, and it's just not true. There certainly are cultural differences, which is part of why it's important to have self-determination on both sides, because people build things in their societies differently. But even Ramallah is muted. I know exactly what you're talking about. And a lot of that comes from not knowing what the next thing that will happen to you is. Knowing that your life is controlled by someone else's, daily political or security needs, which, as real as those needs may be, they will never be your daily political or security needs. And I think that that's a really important thing to keep in mind in trying to center each side's narratives without it pushing the other one out.
I think that actually kind of reminds me. So as well as being involved with J Street U, I studied abroad for some time in Jerusalem at the Hebrew University, which is actually located in East Jerusalem, which was originally the Palestinian half of the city, but has since been annexed by Israel. So now it'll have pockets of Arab populations, but also have pockets of Israelis, just kind of living around there. And so I was living in this apartment complex for students, and then we had to walk up this giant hill to get to the Rothberg School, which is the international school there. And it was really interesting because we would go to class and we'd walk up this hill. We'd walk by cemeteries. We would walk by coffee shops. Like, it's like you wouldn't think that anything is kind of different about this half, except while we're sitting in class, we'll hear, we'll like look outside and we see the wall. We see the wall separating Israel and Palestine. We see a Palestinian neighborhood that has essentially been blocked in just by surrounding like Israeli settlements and neighborhoods, and the school itself just didn't talk about it. There's a lot that just goes unsaid while you're in Israel, which I think that was probably the most astounding portion of it, was seeing just like how much of it is like people just kind of wouldn't talk about. And so I, being the curious person that I am, I got involved with different activisms while I was over there. And so I actually went and saw this Palestinian neighborhood, and it was so interesting because they talked about like, oh, we have technically 4 streets that are able to go out of the city, but sometimes they block off 3 of them, so we only have 1, which makes it harder to get to work. And that's just so different from the narrative that I think I was given growing up, was kind of talking about how like, oh, like it's only anger, like they can't survive whenever they're with each other. There's just like there's no way for it to work. And it's like whenever there are steps taken to like actively suffocate livelihood, yeah, life does look a little muted and it looks a little suffocated. But I think that like living there, I think also put it in an entirely new perspective as well. Because it was no longer just a 10-day trip for me. It was also the place that I lived, and I would have to pay attention of whether or not there were rockets being fired from Gaza, or whether or not there were gunshots on the other side of the wall. And just like kind of figuring out like, what does it mean to, in the way that I've been actively taking in the conflict and been taking in the stories and the history, what does it mean to passively live it? Because I was still going to class, I was still studying like Jewish thought and theology, but what does it mean whenever my background is no longer, like the background to my learning is actually where I've been spending so much time and effort thinking about.
I think for me, the moment that everything clicked was when we went to the West Bank and they took us first to a settlement. We talked to these settlers who were just talking about how proud they were that Israel existed and how the Jewish people have finally had self-determination. And one of the women pulled out a Christian Bible, and she said, this Bible here tells me that my people was here before me, and like nobody else was before me, and this gives me the right to the land. But then we went into Ramallah and we heard from other speakers who were Palestinians, and they talked to us about how they had no freedom. And some of them talked about how they grew up seeing IDF soldiers every day with their rifles, and they were scared because one of them was a guy, and he was talking about the more he grew up, the more afraid he got, because when you are not seen as a kid, when you are seen as a man, then they see you as a possible threat, and you have to be very careful. And then another woman talked about how she was sexually harassed at one of the checkpoints going into Israel proper. So these dual narratives, they're really stuck with me, because you realize that they see the conflict in very different ways. But then I also went to the border with Gaza, and we talked to Israelis there who had shelters everywhere because the Hamas fired rockets towards them almost like very frequently. And that also stuck with me because they also live in fear. So there is a lot of pain and fear on both sides, and it's really hard to kind of grapple with that because we in America don't, at least I don't feel that way every day, and I can't imagine what it's like to feel, to live that way every single day of your life. So it's a very complicated conflict, and the work we do is very important, but there's a limit on what we can do. But I think it's our responsibility to do the best we can because American taxpayers' money is going towards Israel a lot. So we play a part in this conflict, and we have to be very aware of where our money and what is going and what our elected officials are doing.
Yeah, I think what you said about recognizing there's pain and fear on both sides there is key as we think about what our role is, because as much as America, I think in particular, has a narrative that we can just keep our hands off of foreign conflicts except when we don't want to, it's just not true. The United States is the most powerful country in the world that is the underpinning of the international order, and pretty much everything that happens in the UN happens with or without the United States' blessing. There's no way that we can keep our hands off, so we have to know where our hands are. I don't know, does anyone else have something they want to say before we head to Q&A?
I think we have all kind of given our stories. So at this point, Rebecca and Dana.
Hi, thank you guys so much for giving us just your stories and how you got more involved in J Street and just the Israel-Palestine conflict in its entirety.